Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So, do you guys remember this model? Or maybe this one? Or even this one? So, these are some of the VTuber models that I have made so I can use them for my art streams. I kind of like having something to represent myself while I'm drawing on stream or just hanging out, so I'm not just like a random sentient voice. But I've also made other models as well as other projects in Live 2D, like animated illustrations or even these little live wallpapers for Samsung phones. But today, I wanted to make a new VTuber for myself, a bit of like an updated look, but not too many major changes, I hope. Also, this is going to be a reminder right off the bat that this is not going to be a tutorial. So it's just going to be me showing you kind of the process of me making my new VTuber model. I'm a very lazy rigger and a novice, so please do not look to me for any advice. There are plenty of people out there, and I'll leave some links in the description that can give you better step-by-steps or more of like a tutorial kind of way on how you can make your own model. So please check those out instead or do your own research. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at some of my sketches. So I ended up doing a bit of planning and brain jumping in my sketchbook specifically, as I kind of find that this is the fastest way for me to push out ideas, and luckily it didn't take me too long to come up with some sort of idea that I really liked. Granted, I did not really take time to do any color comps or anything like that. I did save a few to like a Pinterest board, which I'll show you guys right here. But for the most part, I just wanted the general look to be somewhat sketched out before we move on. But right off the bat, there is going to be one difference from this model compared to every previous model I've made in the past. And that is purely making the entire VTuber artwork in Procreate rather than in Clip Studio Paint this time. So let's go ahead and move on to Procreate. But I was actually not sure really how to go about making a full model in Procreate. So if you are not familiar with Procreate or some of the other art programs, all of them technically have a layer limit. I remember a long time ago, I figured out what paint tool size layer limit was by accident. I don't really know why I was using so many layers, but I think it's like just shy of 300. It's anywhere between like 250 to 300, I think is for paint tool size version 1. But in Clip Studio Paint, I don't think anyone has seen the layer limit. I hope no one has, because I believe it's 10,000, and I don't know what you're doing that requires you to have 10,000 layers. But in Procreate, your layer limit's gonna really depend on a few different factors, so such as the type of device you have, the device space, how large your canvas is, and your resolution. So I personally have the 9th generation iPad that has 256 gigabytes. I was a bit scared, but I was not going to be able to make a full model in Procreate alone, but there is a YouTuber that has a good breakdown of how she separates her models into different sections and different canvases, which kind of allows you to have more layers and focus on different parts, so you can kind of minimize the amount of space you're taking up on the canvas, which then allows you to have more layers. So I highly recommend checking out that person so you can figure out how you want to separate your model, as I found it very, very helpful. So the YouTuber that I mentioned earlier is merely Wufei. I might have butchered their name, I do apologize, but I did end up using part of their tutorial as well for like the eye rigging in physics, in their words, kind of like the squishing and squashing of certain elements, as well as just like very general tips about rigging. But I ended up rigging everything else just as I knew normally, because there are some features that I know how to use, but I don't know how to use them so proficiently enough that it doesn't make everything just look janky right away without me knowing how to fix them properly. So even though my model will look somewhat janky during the rigging process, you don't really see it as much when my model is fully rigged. So hopefully it'll be okay and we can just like move on from that portion and just use the model as is. But we'll talk about the rigging once we get to that portion of the video. So I started off with sketching out a very rough sketch version of my model here, and I recommend that if you do not have an idea of what your model will look like, then do several iterations as well as like color comps. I definitely forgot that I was going to be picking kind of like a different color scheme in the end, so I didn't really do any color combinations, looking into color palettes until we started doing, I think it's either the hair portion or the clothing portion portion where I actually needed to actually finalize some sort of color comp for everything. But once the sketching portion was kind of finished, I will then follow similarly to Mirli's video and separate the parts into their own canvases. So I duplicated my sketch in Procreate several times, just kind of like in the gallery portion of the window of Procreate. So go into each of these canvases and you can kind of like crop down the parts up until you know, I guess like the certain amount of area. Do give yourself a little bit of leeway here and there if you're going to need it. That way we can kind of focus on each individual part and we'll color them as such rather than coloring the entire thing on one canvas. So for me, the head was kind of fairly small, so I ended up merging that with the eyes as one canvas. Then I did the hair, clothing, I think it's upper torso, and then I had the legs. But I will later on be adding one more version of the sketch again because I noticed that I had too many parts during the upper torso portion that I was not able to add some of the details, so I ended up doing that on its own separate canvas as well. But if you guys are not familiar with how to check how many layers your canvas is going to have, luckily as you're cropping down on your canvas, it will give you a look at how many layers you have at the very top of the cropping window. So you can always check how many layers right off the bat, and that layer at the very top is kind of like your layer limit. Otherwise, if you need a reminder while you work, you can also go check by going through actions, then canvas, canvas information, and then layers. And then you can see how many total layers you have, how many layers you can use, and how many layers that are still available. So I only had about 5 layers for a 4000 by 7000 canvas with 300 DPI. And while sketching, I did hit that cap because even though I typically like to sketch in one layer, I needed to separate some of the parts of my brain as I wanted to have different layers of clothing for my model as well. So after splitting up my model into face, hair, torso, upper body clothing, and legs, I will then add another split whenever I need it, but we can actually start to do some of the coloring, rendering, and line work for your model. So while I'm working on that, I will kind of explain a little bit why I wanted to change from making my model in Procreate versus working in Clip Studio Paint. And the biggest reason is my approach in coloring. So I realized a little bit later that I think working in Clip Studio Paint would have been fine, as I ended up working pretty cleanly regardless because of how you have to separate your layers in whichever art program you're using for live 2D. And because of the very specific layer cutting, I guess, or layer separation, I wasn't able to paint or like work as more painterly as I would like. So in Clip Studio Paint, I haven't found my exact favorite brush or made my favorite brush quite yet for coloring. There's some like pretty close ones, but I still find that there is a difference from whenever I work in Clip Studio Paint versus working in Procreate. There's something just a bit more painterly in a way, in a very loose way, I guess. A loose term of painterliness, I guess I can say it, as well as the way that everything appears a little bit more softer, I find a little bit more appealing in Procreate versus how I color in Clip Studio Paint. But like I said, while I was working on separating the pieces and started doing the coloring, I found it very similar to how my model looked anyways in Clip Studio Paint. So maybe I could have saved myself a little bit of trouble by just committing to Clip Studio Paint, but who knows. I'm pretty sure it's because of how I have to break down every layers that I wasn't able to paint everything all at once. And I do rely on like color picking on certain areas that are close by to give it more of that slightly painterly look and having colors that I really like overall on the entire thing rather than just on, separate parts. And maybe that's me just not being able to do a very rough draft and importing that into every section and color picking the same way that Mirli does in their video, so that they are able to keep their colors, I guess, more consistent or like consistent with the color palette that they had decided at the very beginning. But I think the face was pretty straightforward, as well as the eyes. I actually really do like how I painted the eyes for this particular model, so at least that's a plus. But the rendering overall, I think for the model, turned out the way that I wanted it to be for the most part. Like I said, it's a little bit softer whenever I work in Procreate versus Clip Studio Paint, so maybe that's the reason why I might like it a little bit more, in particular for this model. So, kind of like layer management, I did want to make sure that parts that were going to be covered regardless, I wanted them to be fully finished to a certain degree as well. So, like for my head, I guess, of the model, I wanted to make sure that the scalp is fully bare. I think I've always done this for every model, and I think most people do anyways, regardless if the hair covers the entirety of the scalp. But the thing that I did not do for my previous models in the past was that when I was doing clothing, I would only give very minimal overlap, and that's not like the worst way to work, but I find it a little bit difficult if you want to do like an update on your model, if you don't have some sort of semblance of a body underneath to give it, I guess, like your model a better idea of how you want to place clothing in the future. So for this attempt, I ended up doing basically a basic body underneath everything. And I only really did this for the upper torso-ish area and like the arms. And I completely forgot about it when I was doing the legs for some reason. Maybe because I wasn't wearing anything that was like remotely baggy. So I didn't feel like I needed to redraw the legs. But maybe in the future, I will put that back in because I can always update this whenever I want to technically. So that will be a future me problem. Who knows if I'll add anything to this model anyways. But while I was working on the hair and or the clothing, I don't really remember which one in particular, but I actually had to decide on the colors. So I was kind of torn between mostly having a light blue cardigan or a navy blue cardigan, and then deciding what would be the inner turtleneck sweater color would be. And that's kind of mostly the color palette that I was kind of balancing with. And I ended up going with the light blue, even though like in real life I wear much more navy colors typically, or even like darker colors other than, let's say, maybe like a beige and or brown kind of sweater-ish cream color maybe even. But for the most part, I thought maybe I could just stick with the light blue as it was a little bit closer to what my previous models look like. And I don't know if I have attachment to them, so I didn't want to stray too far away from the different color palette that I could have went with. But we can also adjust those in the future. And because I have the kind of base model of the body for at least the upper torso portion of my model, I can always go in and maybe just add different clothing to it and just re-rig it. I don't think it'll be too much of a pain to rig the clothing because I did the rigging for both the upper torso and the arms as well as the lower body very simple. It's not really anything too crazy. It's very, 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 very minimal. Oh, I don't think I really talked about the entire look of my model. So previously in my old ones, I've always drawn myself wearing kind of like a hoodie, either with like the half 3/4 zip up, whatever you want to call it, or just like a full hoodie in general. After high school, I've always worn like cardigans and I've worn sweaters, I've worn sweatshirts, I've worn crew neck sweaters, like all that kind of stuff. So cardigans have always been my favorite. They're always very comfy, they're soft. I do get cold very easily, so I do like wearing something like a cardigan, but also it's a little bit more breathable because I like to get them slightly oversized. So even if I get a little bit too hot, it's not too like clammy, sticky, kind of congested feeling, if that makes sense. So for this model, I wanted to go more cozy-ish looking, but still looking very casual and still keeping the general look of what my previous model looked like, with slightly off the shoulder kind of look for the sweater on top of some sort of turtleneck. And like I said, I might be attached to my old models, so I kept the turtleneck basically the same as my previous model, with the clover glowing in the center of the base of the neck of the turtleneck, as well as just like a very much a ribbed sort of sweater for the inside. And then after that, I ended up doing a slightly more baggier, chunkier cardigan for myself, and this having it have a very subtle gradient from being more saturated and dark at the base and moving slowly to a lighter, more white-ish aesthetic at the very top, kind of similar to how I had like the two-toned hoodie for my previous model. I didn't really want to do two-tone directly for the cardigan, but I thought it'd be still cute to have not just like one solid color. And I did end up hitting the maximum layer limit when I was working on the clothing, so I ended up going back and duplicating the sketch once again, cropping down to where the torso is and adding in some of the extra details, which happens to be little ribbon that ties at the very front where the cardigan is, as well as on my sleeves I have kind of like the crisscross of the ribbons alongside with little sprouts at the very end. I always love this aesthetic of kind of like chunky ribbons in a very chunky sweater. I think it just looks so cute and like very girly, kind of delicate, just kind of cozy and cute. So I'm still kind of like referencing to my old model. With that being said, I'm not going to be recycling or retiring my old model. It'll be just kind of like in a cycle. So like every so often I'll probably pull it out alongside with like my chibi model. If not, I'm considering making an updated version of my chibi model too. I might just update her clothing instead because everything else is pretty much consistent for the most part. I didn't really change my hair too much other than I think making it more of a slightly green blue for the tips of my hair rather than like a blue purple like I did previously, but it's not too big of a change. And I still like my chibi model, so I don't really want to change her too much because I know I will be more disappointed in it probably if I redo it completely. But enough with the rambling. I'm hoping that at this point I have the artwork kind of done at this state, and I'm going to export them all as a .psd file, and I'm going to send them to myself via Dropbox. Then we can open them all up in Clip Studio Paint, make a full canvas that showcases the entire model with the sketch, and then reassemble everything in Clip Studio Paint, hopefully aligning everything and getting it all ready so that we can have a full finished file ready to export to, or I guess like import, ready to import into Live 2D. So other than some areas that just need to be aligned, I did end up using the symmetry tool in Procreate, and to kind of like save on layers, I did not immediately split them. So I knew I was going to split them once I brought them back into Clip Studio Paint, so I could split them almost all at once all together, because a lot of them were like the clothing sleeves or the ribbons or the, I guess like I needed to split the eyes, I needed to split the ear, I needed to split hands, I needed to split sleeves, cuff, or like sides of the sweater. I need to split legs and shoes. But not only that, I needed to rename everything in a naming convention that makes sense to me. So I put everything on the left hand side of the canvas as R, and then everything on the right hand side of the canvas, I labeled them as L. And oh boy, now we are on to the rigging. So just a lot of information for rigging is just, at least to me, is a lot to take in. So it's a lot of trial and error, a lot of like looking up what's wrong with what I'm doing, why am I getting an error, all this stuff. So rigging does take a lot out of me, and I think it will be a very fun learning experience if you've never done it before, but it's very daunting because of how much you have to learn in order to make something move in the end, I guess. But luckily, I don't mind. That's a lot of trial and error, and it's a lot of testing out your own preferences and your own style and all that stuff. So it's kind of fun as long as you're not on a deadline. So for the first part of rigging, I was following Marily's video, and I think it's because I was really liking how they did the rigging for the eyes and the physics especially. So I wanted to do some of like the cool lighting, a little bit of the squishing squashing of like the pupil or the eye and the iris, as well as like a little bit of the light moving inside my eyes whenever I blink. So I did follow their tutorial for that. But later on, like I mentioned, I ended up doing the rest of the rigging for the face, the hair, and the body, as I knew how to do it from my previous model. And part of that is because, like I said, I'm a bit on the lazy side, and I was kind of giving myself a bit of a time constraint, so I didn't really want to go through the entire tutorial and trying to go back and forth and pausing the video, going to my model, unpausing, and all that. But I think for their method, like I mentioned earlier, I do understand how a lot of the tools work in Live 2D, except for gluing. I have not tackled that yet, but maybe in the future I will. But for the most part, I understood the reasonings behind why they were doing their method to their rigging. But for me, following it, I was not satisfied with the overall look of it because of, I guess like, It's the dang warp deformers I think I'm not using to their full potential, so a lot of my model looked very messed up at the very beginning. So I ended up restarting and just doing the angles manually for the most part and then fixing it up. But I did end up using their tutorial again when I ended up doing the rigging for the mouth forms and then a little bit for parts of the hair. I did not do or like go into a deep dive of learning how to do the skinning for the hair. I would like to do that in the future. I think the hair is like one of the parts that I'm kind of most upset about when I'm looking at this particular model because I definitely rigged it as just one full chunk basically. So it's not really flowy by any means, but it has enough movement, but it doesn't look like my model is like completely a flat object, I guess. So I won't bore you guys with the rest of the rigging. I am just gonna breeze through the rest of this so you don't have to be tortured in watching me make my VTuber look very janky. But while we finish up with some last minute things in kind of like the rigging process, adding our physics, I'm gonna export the texture atlas, export the physics file, and then finally export the mock file, I guess, for our live 2D model in general. I'm going to save everything and duplicate all of those files and then drag and drop that into the Vtube Studio model folder. And then that way we can move on to Vtube Studio because I have a little bit of fixing that I have to do and it's always good to check your model. So once I have Vtube Studio open, we can go ahead and test out the model and figure out any of the problems. So if you want to check for any clipping or things that were not connected, I had a problem with one of the eye parameters was not set fully to have my eye open completely when I look shocked. So I had to go back into the model back in Live 2D, kind of fix it up again, re-export the model file, and then replace that one into the Vtube Studio folder. So it was a lot of back and forth of me testing. I ended up also changing my mouth forms a little bit. I didn't really like what the default looked like for myself, so I ended up making it a little bit more smiley. I also decided to get rid of my lower teeth. Maybe it was because of my previous model, I did not really have like my bottom teeth showing, and it makes me look like I'm baring my teeth a little bit too much. So I ended up moving it low enough so that you can kind of see the inside of my tongue and the back of my teeth, like near the molars-ish area every so often. And then it's just adjusting settings to make sure your mouth opens and closes, your eyes open and close properly when your eyes are open, and it's just, you just want to match it to your in real life movements to the best of your abilities. I just wanted to have something again so that I could use it for the next future stream, which might be tomorrow because I believe that it will be Sunday by the time this video comes out. So hopefully I will be able to debut that model for that stream. I'd really just want to draw something and just chat with you guys again. So hopefully that will be the case. And yeah, I do really enjoy doing some sort of just basic rigging. I don't know if I like VTuber rigging in particular versus or every so often I like doing it because it's a nice challenge for myself and I get to spend a little bit longer on a very longer project that's specifically for myself. Otherwise, I do like learning Live 2D and just playing around with the animation feature so that I can do a lot of key points and all that stuff to make very small little animations for my OCs and bringing them to life, or little projects like my intro, my outro screen for both my streaming setup and the videos. So hopefully in the future I will do a few more videos where I'll show you guys the rigging process, because I've always been alluding to a chibi kind of intro type of video for my OCs, and I still really want to do it. I might go a little bit more ham, so I might kind of combine it with actual animation in Clip Studio Paint and the rigging in Live 2D. We'll see. I might be a little bit intimidated by actually doing real animation versus just learning how to do the rigging in Live 2D, which is not a problem. It's just my preference, I guess. So hopefully you guys enjoyed watching this. I will switch over to myself, I think, in my VTuber model to close out the video. Oh, I guess I never filmed an outro, but thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!